you can buy funny swag on our website now. And it will help support all of our hosting costs and Zoom costs and Adobe costs and all this stuff. So if you're interested, go to our website /swag, and there's some cool stuff on there.
I'm sharing my screen right now. We're gonna do a. Can everyone see?
Mm-hmm.
We've got a microgrids are dope sweater, which they are. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. And then some hats with DER task force badges. I think, are the badges come with the sweater too, or I guess not. But
No.
do the badges come on the sweater too anywhere, or?
Yeah, we'll stick it on the sleeve.
Cool. So if you want to be, an elite member of the DER task force, get your badge and your swag. Just click donate here, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory from there.
And Tanya, love the idea. Demand flexibility is dope. We're also here for future recommendations as we get this all launched. So you guys want something, let us know. We'll sort of start collating things.
Word is that this month, Duncan, I wasn't sure if you were going to do this update, but Ethan, you'll be excited to know we want to host a power grid game where the winner gets, a free piece of swag. So keep an eye out for that. But anyways, Duncan, we'll kick it back to you.
Cool. So that's one thing. Another is, so this will be October's meetup. In November, we're actually having 2 meetups, both of which are super cool, and we're really excited about them. One of them will also be our first partnership with another big energy organization you all probably know. So stay tuned on both of those. I think they'll both be super exciting. All right, so today we're here to talk about FERC 2222. And I kind of reached out to everybody I knew and said, who's the person to talk to? Who should we be able to ping questions off of, get their insight from? And it came to realize Peter is definitely someone we're lucky to get to speak with today. I've gotten to know him mainly from Twitter, as is true of many of you. Although when he lived on the East Coast and I did at the same time, we actually got to see each other in person maybe a handful of times. But Peter works on distributed energy policy at Centrica. He's definitely a part of Energy Twitter's policy Illuminati. He's always commenting on things like this, and I think super insightful. Previously, he was at EnerNOC and Pulse Energy and the Vancouver Economic Development Corporation. Has all the degrees, business management and philosophy and politics and economics. Very intelligent person. But really, we're here to hear about what's going to happen with this potentially, huge FERC order for distributed energy. And I think maybe just to kick it off, Peter has just a few sort of introductory comments, what he thinks this might hold. And then as usual, we're going to transition to just community discussion. I think some of us on the organizing side will kick it off with a few questions, but then please feel free to put yours in the chat as they pop into your head. And we'll make sure you get called on sort of at the right time when it's relevant. Ideally, we'll just ask you to unmute and say your question. Otherwise, try to stay muted just because we have, over 50 people on this, and it can get a little crazy if everybody starts like
that.
Amazing timing. Yeah.
There you
Beautiful
go.
cue.
Dog was like, "Screw you, Duncan. I'm butting in whenever I want."
Yeah. So with that, Peter, do you want to kick it off for us?
Sure. Happy to, Duncan. Yeah, as Duncan said, I'm Peter Cavan. I'll not repeat all of it, but I live in a little town in Washington State called Mount Vernon. When I'm outside of Washington State, I usually just say I'm in Seattle. Really, I'm about 90 miles away. But anyway, I look after distributed energy policy and for North America for Centrica Business Solutions. So primarily policies that deal with solar, battery storage, demand response, energy efficiency for business customers. So as we'll get to, that's fairly relevant to what I know. There's a great deal of debate, including on energy Twitter, on what to call it. It's a debate that I've mostly tried to avoid. It is Order 2222, or I guess you really want to be particular about it, you could call it 2222. For today, I'm just going to say that I'm going to call it the DER order. Some people go back and forth when they have to go like 2x4, other names that include the number, but I'm just calling it the DER order. You can just take from context. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, so Duncan had asked for 5-10 minutes of sort of a backgrounder. I think a lot of people will be aware of, perhaps more on the sort of the docket basis, what the background is, so like how we got here in terms of we had a long delay from FERC to getting to here. I frankly expected that we would have gotten this order around the time I started working at Centrica, which was now over 3 years ago. So about every 6 months, I've told people that I work with that it'll be ready in about 6 months. In the last 6 months, I suppose I stopped being a liar, which is nice. But okay, I know a lot of people obviously clearly on this task force are incredibly up to date on DRs. Just to step back for a second, clearly we have a ton of DRs today, rapidly growing area. Many of those installed for on-site reasons, some of those for retail programs. Many of those do participate in wholesale markets today. Most obviously demand response. My personal favorite in these things is PJM. Peak load of about 150 gigawatts. Depending what year you look at, you're looking at somewhere like 8 to 15 gigawatts of that coming from demand response. So those are resources participating in the wholesale market. So I think I would just push back a little on some of the coverage of this is, oh, like DRs are coming to wholesale markets. They're there in part. So I suppose that's in some ways, the more positive way of looking at the history. The more negative, or frankly, the more realism, whatever word I'm looking for, way of looking at history is distributed energy could do a ton more in wholesale markets than what it's actually been able to do so far. Those wholesale markets were formed reasonably enough with the dominant sources of energy at the time, centralized power plants. Distributed energy resources, or DRs as I'll mostly call them, we get into the club, but with restrictions that in practice make it difficult or impossible to actually sell the services they're capable of. I mean, just to mention two, one is sort of effectively a size constraint. So like I said, the system operators run huge grids, PJM, about 150 gigawatt peak, about 130 million Americans covered. They dispatch thousands of power plants on a minute-by-minute basis. They do not, in most cases, want to optimize millions of devices on a device-by-device basis. So for the smallest resources, they've been told either don't participate at all or aggregate up to a size of system operators comfortable, which can be anywhere, depending on what product and market you're looking at, anywhere from usually about 100 kilowatts up to 5 megawatts. Another bucket of restrictions is starting every design of new rules, which is what I spend most of my day-to-day on, with what has worked for large centralized generators, and then making often mostly minor tweaks downward from there. So, if you have a resource participating in a wholesale market in some specific product that has to meter their output and communicate with the grid via telemetry, if you say that costs $50,000 to set up and $10,000 a year to run, if you're a 700 megawatt gas plant, that's fine. You can pay that tomorrow. If you're, you want to aggregate, 300 kilowatts of solar or storage or something like that, it doesn't make any sense. And frankly, in many cases, we have cheaper and better ways of doing that that exist today, didn't exist when the rules were written. Sorry. Anyway, so that's just some background. I'm aware many people are entirely up to date in that, but I think it sets the scene. What is the DER order, as I'm not going to call it, do? It says that DERs, and indeed aggregations of DERs, could no longer be second-class citizens in wholesale markets. The core judgment is that distributed energy's treatment has not been fair, and that the wholesale markets need to get their act together to fix it. Or to say the same thing in FERC speak, to sweep away the unduly discriminatory or preferential barriers to participation. But frankly, I prefer the way I put it. So just a few other things before I stop. One is, what will it do in practice? In practice, it will encourage more distributed energy, particularly renewable generation, battery storage, and advanced load curtailment. They'll be able to fairly compete in wholesale markets, which means they will win energy payments, capacity payments, ancillary services from some of the other resources that are sitting right there today. It will lead to a cleaner grid, it will lead to a more reliable grid, a more cost-effective grid for those, admittedly, those living under wholesale markets. And I'm happy to get into more of the, the details of what's, all the details of what's changed by the order, later in the call. Just a couple of things I'll say while I'm here. One is, who does it apply to? Does it apply to everybody? The answer is no. It applies to many people, but not all. So in one sentence, it applies to customers living under wholesale markets who are customers of larger utilities. So if you're under ERCOT, for example, this doesn't apply to you. If you're not under a wholesale market, it doesn't apply to you. If you're under PJM, ISO New England, New York ISO, MISO, SPP, and California ISO, then it probably does. The exception to that is that if your utility sells less than 4 million megawatt hours of power each year, their state regulator has to opt them in. So to put it another way, if you're a customer of a utility that people in other states have heard of, whether that's PSE&G or Pacific Gas and Electric or Con Ed or ComEd, then yes, you're part of this. If you're particularly with some of the munis and co-ops that tend to be on the smaller side, then your state regulator would have to opt you in. And then just the final sort of bucket of thing I'll talk to is just to say that this is it has been an incredible slog for many people, both individuals and organizations and companies to get us to this place of getting distributed energy's role at the table. But really, this is just the end of the beginning. FERC effectively, via the DR order, sets out riverbanks. It says, here are the boundaries within, the participation of DRs have to be within wholesale markets, but it's up to each ISO to respond with a compliance plan and make that vision a reality. Some ISOs, and New York, for example, comes to mind, frankly, will point to existing plans that they already have in place that aren't necessarily active today, but at least have been submitted and are in the works to happen in the future. And we'll say, we're 95% of the way there. Maybe we tweak some things, but we're basically good to go. Other ISOs will have to dust off old plans that were under consideration often in sort of the 2015 to 2017 timeframe, and then got put on the shelf once it became clear that FERC wasn't going to rule anytime soon, or indeed to some degree start afresh, or really have a lot of work to do, frankly, over the next year. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Awesome stuff, Duncan. I don't know if you want to jump in with questions, or I know I have like one or two simple ones to maybe set us up, and then we can kick it over to the audience. People, you guys can start like asking questions in the chat, and then we'll kind of aggregate or call on people or whatever to try and keep it somewhat orderly. But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to start and say, like, is this, like, everyone's calling it landmark and all the headlines, like, is this, do you think, when we look back at, are we going to look back on this like maybe the way we did PURPA? Like, is there like the grid before FERC Order 2222 and after? Like, is this really a seminal moment as far as advancing the integration of DERs into energy markets, or do you think it's maybe even more than that, less than that? Like, what's kind of your general takeaway about how how monumental this actually is? Because there's been all sorts of headlines kind of pointing to it being a real landmark ruling. So curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say landmark. Yeah, I'd say landmark is an appropriate way to describe it. I mean, talking about PURPA was obviously much broader. It did all sorts of things. I mean, what people often end up thinking about is effectively, sort of 20 to 80 megawatts, primarily solar farms, in large part in, the Carolinas and a few other places. But it really changed all sorts of things. Clearly, this is not anywhere near as broad of that. And also, and as I tried to, I think, cover on the day it came out actually on Energy Twitter with a few different people, the degree to which it will make an impact is very much, it is also very, differs a lot, but region by region. So as I said, it's not 100% there, but so to go back a bit, in New York, they spent most of the last 2 years coming up with the DER participation model that actually got approved by FERC, I believe, earlier this year. Was supposed to go into effect actually in the middle of next year. Now, for a variety of reasons, gets pushed around, but is probably going to take effect towards the end of 2022. It is fair to say that was encouraged by the fact that FERC was doing what it was doing, but they decided to go ahead anyway. So my point is, if FERC had simply sat on this and not come out with this order, in large part, the world in New York would look like the world is going to be. And obviously you see everything else, everything from CLCPA to what, various parts of, state and other organizations are doing to push the clean and distributed energy future. So I think, perhaps you could say in New York specifically, it may have less of a landmark impact. In other regions like, PJM and MISO, which is ultimately where I'd have to sit and do my math, but probably where just about half or perhaps more than half of the US's energy gets sold, I think it could have a much deeper impact in places, frankly, that today we don't often, it's not, you say distributed energy people, where do they think of? They most often think of, frankly, New York, California, a few other states. In the states which have not been as high up that list previously, I think it absolutely could be incredibly impactful. But I guess just the final proviso, and I'll try not to say this to every question, but I just want to reinforce that so much of what the impact will be is specific to what the ISOs will do, which in many cases, they will spend much of the next year fighting it out. It's not so much they have to get stakeholder approval, but will spend debating it with their stakeholders. And insofar as we get good, solid, sensible, workable plans out of those ISOs, that will drive a lot of the answer to your question.
Sorry, Duncan, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. I'm kind of surprised you said you anticipate, for example, maybe that this impact being larger in, say, PJM than New York. And this kind of goes right into a question I've been thinking about, which is in PJM, for example, we have wholesale market access or participation access, right, through the various demand response programs offered by the ISO. You can essentially get exposure to capacity energy in some ancillary services. So when you say it will have a big impact, are you saying sort of more assets, more DER types and sizes will get this access, or that the access itself will kind of be broader and more holistic?
So I think, it's probably worth here distinguishing between there's sort of I probably need like a whiteboard or something to do these graphs, but there's where will DERs grow most over the next few years? And then there's sort of the separate, the more detailed question of within the world that would have existed without the DER order, where is it that the DER order will make the biggest difference? So, there will be a lot of progress on DERs in New York, for example. That is absolutely true and will continue to be true over the next few years. Specifically, the difference that you would see out of the DER order, in large part because NISO is to some degree doing it anyway, and they had a FERC approved plan to do most of what is in the DER order anyway. It's harder for me to say the DER order from FERC that we got, whatever it was, 2 weeks ago, will make a huge difference in New York. Now, you can like work backwards in that argument of, well, maybe if FERC had never kicked it off with the NOPR in 2015, 2016, then NISO never bothers to do it. But that's a level of like hypothetical I'm not as comfortable with. To your other point around PJM, this gets obviously in the details very quickly. I think, yes, there is some degree of aggregation allowed in PJM. Was obviously demand response, which I mentioned, which is a very healthy market in PJM today. It's gone down somewhat over the last few years, but I mean, they're still looking at somewhere like 8 to 9 gigawatts of the stuff. There's a lot of it there, but there are a lot of restrictions around the edges which do limit what's possible. I mean, so you got in most markets that aren't currently ISO in England, DR as it's considered cannot inject. So where you get, if you want to aggregate, say, traditional load curtailment or backup generation with, say like, if you have storage or so that particularly wants to inject, that's either difficult or impossible. Or, yes, aggregation is possible, but typically aggregation is both incredibly limited geographically and also is quite restricted in terms of, the total size you can aggregate up to. So I believe it's, so for example, you can aggregate water heaters. So on the residential side, there are water heaters in PJM delivering frequency response, and effectively under the PJM rubric, they are as demand response. But there are a number of restrictions on that. They can only be in the same utility. They can only be in the same subzone, and I believe the total size aggregation caps out at 1 megawatt. So obviously, if you're aggregating 3 kilowatt water heaters, a 1 megawatt is some degree unthinkably high restriction. If you want to aggregate 5 megawatt industrial plants, a 1 megawatt restriction is somewhat, it's the end of the business case. So I do think it will make a meaningful impact in those areas.
So on the backs of that question and something that's gotten upvoted a bunch in the chat, Sean's question, sort of getting actually more into the weeds of the order itself, because like I only kind of read the fact sheet, and something that really stood out to me is like, I think DR is sort of its own thing, but when we really talk about like flexible demand, it's about like integrating these resources actually into like real-time energy supply markets, real-time capacity markets. And so I'm curious around, so Sean's question was like, can we talk about dual participation and then relate that to net energy metering and retail programs in particular. So when you look at like your point in New York, it sounds like you're talking mostly about like the New York ISO project that they have, but there's also in New York VDER, where within that kind of value stack, you do have a sort of shadow settlement, you could call it, that the utility is setting up of kind of real-time energy prices and when you're exporting and kind of real-time capacity contributions in a sense. So I'm curious, like the fact that the order states, you know, it's not just aggregate DERs and let them participate in ancillary services, which to your point actually exists in most markets already in some form. I'm more interested in like this energy and capacity component. And so does the order actually sort of in a place like PJM where you have net metering actually start influencing and like disrupting net metering in a way? Because if you are to properly integrate an asset, a DER into a wholesale market, like net metering is actually not functionally integrating it into energy and capacity, right? So like to Sean's question, you know, expanding on that in a bit, in a way, can you talk about like this relationship between net metering and then the, you know, the FERC order? Like, do those things collaborate in some way? Dual participation? Like, how does it work in New York? How does it work in PJM? I know it's super loaded, but like, you know, you could obviously speak to that for as long as you want, because I think that's kind of what this all boils down to. Like, is this DR 2.0 or is it something far broader than that?
Yeah, so like 19 questions in that, but I'll try and pull out a few things. So geo-participation, big topic. I'll just step back for a second. My perspective on geo-participation, which I think actually, and this is not particularly common, but was actually more or less, I'll get into details in a second, but it's more or less where FERC ended up in the order, was geo-participation. So often we've thought of geo-participation previously as it's like a yes, no. It's should it be allowed or not? And frankly, in many cases, the answer is no, it shouldn't be allowed. My perspective on geo-participation has always been, yes, it should be allowed, but it is a accounting and technical question. It's not, I will say, I do think some advocates in this area have taken it a bit far of like geo-participation is never a problem, like just don't worry about it, it doesn't matter. I don't take it that far. There are specific accounting and technical reasons why you do want to have rules around it. Most obviously, if you're getting paid for the same service being delivered by the same resource into the same, you know, this functionally the same product at the same time, there's a reasonable argument to be made of you should not be getting paid by multiple different entities at the same time for exactly the same service delivered in the same time. So some degree of being able to back out those payments is, you know, largely reasonable to me. Obviously, as you know, I'm a regulatory advocate, but I work for a developer of these resources. I wouldn't mind getting paid twice, but I can see why, from a market design perspective, you wouldn't see that as entirely reasonable. Also, on more of the operational or technical end of things, you do want your utilities and ISOs to be aware of what the other is doing, and I think that's something that. So one of the specific questions was around what's being done in New York. In the DR, what was often referred to as DR tariff, or what is now called the DR participation model, which is that package of rule changes that was approved by FERC and is due now to go into effect in New York towards the end of the year, or sorry, towards the end of 2022, actually. Excuse me. They do have language there around geo participation. It's not the strongest. I think their heart's in the right place, I guess is the way I put it. They're not the strongest on. They require that obviously you're somewhat simplified by the fact that it's a single state ISO with really 6 primarily major utilities. They're supposed to work together on some of those operational issues. So most obviously, if you have something like, you know, so wholesale DR, SCR, like it's called, and, you know, you have, you know, the utilities. So you have wholesale DR, SCR, you have, you know, utility programs. So, you know, they're in the process actually of rolling out one next year, which is mostly aimed towards batteries, something called auto DLM, where those are dispatched together. You know, each side wants to know about that because they may well be calling a resource or dispatching a resource which is not itself available. I think so to step back to the DR order 2222, call it what you will, it does require geo participation largely along the terms that I said. They're not required to allow compensation twice for the same service. It does directs each wholesale market participant to come up with the rules to that end. I mean, I think frankly, one of the, you know, the areas in which it will be interesting to see how particularly states and to some degree ISOs look at this is there is a clear jurisdictional question here of, you can sort of think of it as dual participation is, it's you can do the retail service, you can do the wholesale service, and you can do both. So there's at least 3 buckets there. And it is not, I would think, others might argue, it is not it is within FERC's jurisdiction to tell the wholesale market operators that you have to allow it in one direction. So if you're participating wholesale, you have to be allowed on the retail side. It is less clear to me, though some have read it this way, that that FERC can even say the opposite, which is that if you're allowed in wholesale, could your state say, to your question, if you're in a wholesale market, we're not going to let you do net energy metering. I don't believe FERC has a jurisdiction to tell people you can't go that way around. So in part, it will depend on, as with a lot of this, it will depend on the fair discussions, interaction, debate between the states, the utilities, and the ISOs, which is the process being kicked off pretty much right now.
So if you're a net metered, like solar farm being built behind the meter in PJM today, it's possible that this order doesn't really affect you, because to me, like, net metering isn't really integrated into the wholesale. Like, I guess it's a more direct question. If it was, it would be getting some like LBMP, rate or capacity payment for being a solar, a generating resource, right? But if it's net metered, it's sort of not exposed to that, like, actual wholesale market operation. So
it isn't today. I mean, I think a couple of things. So one is, ironically enough, despite the fact focus on DR aggregations, the order does require you to have an aggregation of 1. So despite the fact it's sort of a weird way to use the terminology, you can be a DR aggregation of 1. So you could both think of that, 5 megawatt solar plant as it participates in a retail program like net energy metering, and it participates as a aggregation of 1, or frankly, more usefully, as a aggregation with other things like, somebody else has some storage, somebody else has some, some low curtailment, whatever it is, that does participate in wholesale markets. I think some of the, the questions that will inevitably come up there around the aggregation design, which is in some ways the parts of this that I'm most interested in, are things like, both, is there a total cap on the size of the aggregation? So the aggregation, the ISOs can't say that it has to be less than 100 kilowatts. It has to, they can't say that it gets confusing with the terminology. They can't say that the minimum participation size can be larger than 100 kilowatts. And it's using a lot of double negatives. But what they can say is, particularly either on a per site or a per aggregation basis, they can give a total size. So if, for example, PGN came back and said, okay, we'll allow those aggregations, but in total, the aggregation can't be more than, let's say, 8 megawatts. Well, if they say it can't be more than 8 megawatts, what are the other useful services you can get by aggregating things with that? Now, you could do like 2 megawatts of storage, but you're limited in what that 5 megawatt solar plant could usefully participate in. I think, just to use the New York example, what they ended up with was there's actually no total cap on the size of the aggregation, but per site, you can only inject up to 20 megawatts. So you could conceivably have, 5 or 10 different sites each inject 50 megawatts. That's the way they've done it. The other thing, just to finish that thought, is that, there are really 2 ways you restrict the size of the aggregation. One is the energy side, the injection capability, the megawatts. The other is either, most often, on the electrical system itself, or in geography, the scope. I shouldn't use the word size or everything, the scope of the aggregation. So for example, on the New York side, where they ended up with, and they actually haven't finished designing these, but they've said that you can aggregate up to quite large aggregations, because as I said, there's no total cap on the size of the aggregation in a megawatt sense, but you can only aggregate within probably something like 100 to 120 zones within New York State. And New York State, it's not a tiny place, isn't a tiny place, but it's not, it's not all of the US either. So if you have 120 zones, particularly as you get downstate, each of those are going to be quite small. So then it'll be a case of, do you get lucky, so to speak, as a developer, or as as different companies working together to find, I don't know, if your perfect aggregation needs this much solar, this much low curtailment, this much storage, whatever it is, are you going to find it in what, say in the Manhattan case, might be literally just Manhattan, or might be just Queens, or might even be smaller than that. So that's there's a lot in the details of how do they design the aggregation that then gets to the question of, for those, the 5 megawatt solar that we start off with, how useful is this? Because how much of an aggregation can you really participate in?
And I think that plays into, Pamela, your question about nodes and zones. Is there anything you'd want to follow up on there to better get at what you were asking?
Yeah, just for like definition purposes. From my understanding, the NISO program is considered single nodal or single node, and KISO would be zonal. I mean, whatever the hell PJM, their straw design from years ago, they were multinodal. I still don't understand what they were trying to do.
Okay, so there's nothing else you want to, I guess, ask on that though?
Oh, I was just curious from like a technological standpoint, and then from an economical standpoint, what would be feasible? Like, would aggregations not be economical if they were forced to be single node, or, you know, is it too technologic? Like, do we not have the technology to do multi-node or zonal?
Yeah, it's a good question, which is what I say when I try to organize my thoughts. But in this case, it is actually a good question. So you'll get, there isn't a single answer to that. You'll get a different answer from different parts of, even different parts of the US, different parts of the world, and indeed different people who sit in different seats. I think we have seen multinodal work. It works to some degree today in California. There are European markets where they use slightly different terminology, but it's effectively multinodal. You can make it work. The arguments against it, which is not something I often do, but if I step into that seat for a second, the arguments against it would be, you're making, frankly, the lives of the system operator more complicated. If they say, so say you have an aggregation that's got, 10 different sites, each of which has, 10 megawatts at each. So it has total capability of up to 100 megawatts. If they say, okay, we need 60 megawatts of this service, do they know where that service is coming from? On the grid, can they point to a specific node and say, yes, we know where that 60 megawatts is coming from? And then that also doesn't just take account of what is that service doing, but also if, for example, they're looking at, where you have, both distribution and more, in their case, more often transmission hardware that's sitting in the middle, if they're scared about, filling out a transmission line, if they have two different resources that are on both sides of it, they want to know which is coming from which. So I think in some ways, my answer to the question is, so can you technologically do a multinodal aggregation? Yes. Is it economically death knell to not do it? No, I wouldn't put it in quite that extreme case, but it is more difficult. I mean, it kind of goes back to what I said a few minutes ago, that, if we're as a developer like Centrica Business Solutions, like NLX, like C-Power, like other companies in this space, where you're looking to design and build an aggregation, you're looking for, customers with certain attributes, like either, they have DRs today, they're interested in installing them. With the best will in the world and with the best sales force in the world, you don't have those in every location. So, if you have a certain aggregation that makes sense, but you really need, you need 5 megawatts of storage. In some cases, it may make sense, frankly, to get around this by putting it on your own balance sheet, just building it yourself. In most cases, that won't make sense for particularly like customer-facing organizations. So it does become more difficult, and the value you'll get out of the aggregation is somewhat more limited when you are single node. I think a lot of the sort of, frankly, the clash of, I don't know if ideology is the right word, but the clash of sort of thoughts here is that the planning departments and system operators have tended, in most cases, California in most senses is not quite here, but at some of the others, I think it's fair to say the planning departments have very much looked at this in effectively a somewhat static manner of, I feel comfortable, I as a system operator, as the planning staff, et cetera, feel comfortable with, aggregations up to 1 megawatt. I feel comfortable with an aggregation at a single zone. I think my pushback to them is typically along the lines of more dynamic design of that. So, what I'm talking about there is, so say, you have two resources that are on other sides of a certain transmission constraint. The simplest way to handle that is simply to say, sorry, they can never aggregate. And fair enough, that is the way some ISOs might go with that question. Another way of handling it is to say, you have dynamic, so as I said, particularly as you're delivering ancillary services, you are in incredibly frequent, like somewhere between every 2 and every 6 second communication with the ISO. There's no particular reason why they can't say, okay, we need a certain service from you. In 99.9% of cases, you could do it from all of your aggregation. In 0.1% of cases, actually, we need it to not come from over there. We need some sub area of the aggregation to do it. Now, you can't do that all the time, then, in some degree, what's the point in having the aggregation? But my point is there are more dynamic ways of handling these issues that aren't as simple as, we're going to go down to the most granular node that we possibly can, and we're going to say that beyond that, which in some cases, frankly, might be, in the case of New York City, might be a few blocks, we're going to say outside of that, you just can't aggregate. So hopefully there will be more dynamic, smart, call it what you will, ways of handling that particular contradiction.
Another set of questions we had then, Ben, you had like 4 or 5 that all seemed to get a lot of engagement on like preventing double counting, on load reduction versus supply. You also chimed in on a question about sort of like out of market revenues. Do you want to just sort of take the floor for a second and riff on everything you've been talking about in the chat?
Yeah, it actually follows from James's question earlier, which is really about dual participation and whether or not retail rates kind of have to be reformed.
Can we just pause for 1 second and I'll acknowledge that sweet background you have.
Thank you. Thank you. I went as trippy as possible.
Okay, sorry, go on.
So, obviously, in order to really break up the revenues and so they're not double counted, then the retail rate itself may need to be reformed. So I guess I was wondering if you thought that there would be kind of like a ancillary effect there on utility rates as well, potentially, to make them more like VETR and less like net metering. But then there's also other questions about how ISOs and utilities do load forecasting of DER currently, because ISO, I think, doesn't even reflect solar below 5 megawatts right now, that type of thing. And then a good question that I think Austin brought up is, what about distribution level revenues, retail revenues? Are they going to be kind of mopered out anyway, and because they're not available to all market participants? And it just seems like potentially another way to view out of market revenues. So that was kind of the conversation we were having on the side there. I know there was a couple different questions in there, so sorry, Peter.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I try to take notes as you're going. I think just maybe if you could repeat a little bit of the last ones. You were talking about, will they be mopered anyway? So you're on the retail side, presumably that's where the question comes from?
Yeah, so with dual participation, let's say you're collecting energy revenues from the wholesale market and you're able to participate in an NWA or something, are those considered out of market revenues? And is even though they're allowing dual participation, does it in effect, still constrain you from participating in the markets because they're not considered kind of valid or, in market revenues?
Are you saying like if a DSRV value in VETR like almost distorts wholesale market prices because now that resource exists and is getting energy supply revenues? That's really interesting. Okay. Like MOPR, yeah. Okay.
And it could be for energy market mitigation too, theoretically.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot there. So I think, on the MOPR side, yeah, it will have an impact. I mean, I think, it both depends on, where there's, frankly, speaking right now, we're in a strange place with MOPR, given that, we've had, it applies to multiple ISOs. People most often use it or have heard of PJM. We've been through the rulemaking process primarily. We've spent a lot of this year banging our heads against how the rules will be actually implemented in practice at PJM. We're still awaiting the final order from FERC on rehearing, which I expect probably in the next 6 or 7 days, actually. And then that will allow us, for example, to come up with a timeline to actually have a capacity auction, which we're supposed to have had in May of 2019 and might get around to in March or April of 2021. So slightly delayed. The reason I mentioned that is we have MOPR that exists on the book, so to speak, but we haven't actually had any capacity auctions at PJM, which has had it. So then when you start thinking of, okay, well, what were the impacts that we expected it to have? And then what are the different impacts that we expected it to have based on there being a DR order? It does all start to become fairly theoretical fairly quickly. So in part, it becomes a question of how does it change where the capacity markets in particular clear, and how does it, in large part, I think, perhaps one of the underreported parts of the MOPR is how much power it gives, in particular, to the PJM market monitor, who has a lot of control, particularly over the unit-specific exemption. So if, for example, we're given, like, say, like a default minimum offer price of, say $300, and you expect it to clear at 150, so therefore you're never going to get into the minimum offer. But if you go to the market monitor and say, okay, well, on the specific details of my project, my costs, my revenues, etc., I think the number should be 80. Does the market monitor agree with that? And they work with PJM legal to come up with that. So I suppose this is all a long-winded way of saying, well, I suppose for one, I don't know exactly what the impact will be because we don't yet have a great sense of how, in practice, MOPR will take effect. Yes, it will make it more difficult in some cases for, distributed energy to earn, the PJM case capacity revenue. But how much of that, how I don't take that. And also, frankly, I think, we often, particularly from more the residential perspective, we look at it as there's, so the retail revenue and there's wholesale, and the wholesale will always be smaller. And therefore, it's just a case of if you don't get the retail side, or if there's ever a trade-off where you might not go one or the other, then you'll just do the retail and that's fine. I suppose I come from perhaps a somewhat strange perspective in that for many of the customers that I work with that are particularly, are interested in like advanced load curtailment and are, looking to use minor variations in the output of their industrial site to take part in, say, like frequency regulations and other ancillary services, that's not the case. It's really only the wholesale side they're interested in. So in that case, perhaps I, attack this from something of a strange direction. And sorry, there were a ton of questions there. I think one of the other ones.
So maybe go back to the first one, because it does, I think it's sort of revolving around, the chat a lot is like, does basically, I don't know, Ben, you could probably rephrase it better than me, but does it sort of force people, each state to implement VDER-like structures on the distribution grid to account for, avoiding net metering and like double counting? Like, is there any way to not double count a net metered solar array participating also in a wholesale market without a VDER-like structure? Did I butcher that, Ben, or is that basically the?
No, yeah, I think that's right. And then if you even just kind of think back on like, well, what are the parts of the market that are going to get activated by this order? It seems like, Peter, the companies that you work with are already kind of participating in the wholesale market only, side of things. And it's really the smaller resources that are getting retail treatment that could theoretically, but they won't unless, it makes sense to do that, to move away from their retail tariff. So I guess I'm just wondering, it just seems to me like that's a block of this order that may prevent it from changing much, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think there's a number of things there. One is, so does it, do you have to move in a VDER type direction? I don't believe the answer to that is yes. That is certainly one direction you can go. The other is, and I think a lot of this is, I mean, we had the order, whatever it was, approximately 2 weeks ago. I'm simply guessing at the, how all of the players will react to this. We haven't even seen, I mean, the deadline for requests for rehearing is October 21, 17. Anyway, so we haven't even seen who's going to fight this order to the mat, so to speak. You could see, for example, a state pushing back and saying, so it's sort of to some degree, it's, with this double counting, it's you want to take account of what's happening in the other market, but you could see a state saying, well, we're going to keep our rates the way we are, and the wholesale system operator has to, back out all of their payments. So we don't want to change our rates. They have to back it out on the wholesale side. So there's, you don't necessarily have to move in the, major overhauls of the retail rates direction, but obviously that's, for more of the, call them what you will, the more progressive jurisdictions, that is obviously an option open to them.
I guess on that question, in what realm does that play out between, say, state PUC and wholesale market operator if they both don't budge? How does that get resolved?
So that's the hopeful question of the talks break down. Okay. That's a good question. So I suppose one direction to take it would be, would FERC ever find that a distribution, well, no, they don't regulate distribution rates. I don't know the answer to that. I would expect, I mean, it's ultimately state jurisdictional what the retail rate is. If someone could, for example, if say like a DR developer complained to FERC and said, we can't meaningfully deliver on what you want us to do with the DR order because of the, the retail rates that block us from that, that would be an interesting fight. I'm not sure exactly how that would go. But just the final thing there is I would be hopeful that we're not actually going to get there.
I have a similar question actually along the same kind of lines on a potential conflict there. What happens with all the free money that's been given away for like DER incentives for resilience? So like SGIP comes to mind, but other avenues could be there as well. Like if a state just decides it wants to dump a bunch of money for storage for their customers, for their residents, does that cause problems with that being bid into capacity markets? And does FERC take a stance on that?
Free money is an interesting way to describe that.
You could, yeah.
Okay. Well, it depends on the ice you're in. Yes, I mean, it's also another way in which sort of the timing is interesting for this discussion is obviously we have the FERC we have today with 3 members, 2 of which are Republican and obviously passed the DR order as it exists today. We have 2 more on the slate, and it's also entirely possible that we may get a somewhat different executive and potentially a different Senate that may lead to a different FERC down the road. As it exists today, yes, they look disfavorably on what they consider a state subsidy in primarily forward capacity markets. You mentioned SGIP, that has not been a particular issue in California up to this point. So I suppose this might seem a little old-fashioned, but my answer to a state makes a energy choice. It wants more storage, it wants less storage, it wants more nuclear, less nuclear. It puts money, incentives, other ways of encouraging things towards those resources. Unless FERC sticks its toe in a way it frankly does not have to, as it has done in PJM, New York ISO, and ISO New England, the money flows as it has.
Maybe a fun one would be like stepping back from the deep details here. I remember when sort of the original demand response businesses got big, there was a lot of enthusiasm about like sort of behind the meter resources and DERs and everything. And now we're seeing some of that again, right? And it might be fun to sort of just pontificate on, what kind of new business models might arise from this, or who's really well positioned for something like this. Like perhaps there are also entrants we don't see in today's energy market who are in a good place. I don't know, say, auto manufacturers who will be controlling a lot of EV charging. Or is there any sort of just like fun speculation you've been engaging in based on this that we should be privy to?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I can't speak from a purely unbiased basis because, as I said, there are a ton of DRs out there today. There's a lot of DERs being aggregated primarily in the sense of DR being aggregated today. So given that I work for one of those, shockingly, my answer in part will be the companies that do some of those things today. I mean, just to, sort of step out from that a second, I think, who are, to I guess, answer your question in a slightly different way, who are the winners out of this? I mean, the first winner I think of and it sounds a bit corny, frankly, are, you know, the homes and businesses, customers, people that want to want to install DRs for whatever reason, but would be greatly helped by that, even if it doesn't pay for 100% of it, but would greatly help via wholesale revenue. And have been, for a variety of some of the reasons we've talked about already today, have been blocked from doing that. So, you know, you're a business that, you know, for a variety of reasons might want to put, say, a solar and storage system. You know, you could get wholesale revenue today, but it's difficult or expensive or other reasons. This will help to streamline the rules to get cash in your pocket from those wholesale markets. So that's a benefit. We'll get more distributed energy. I think you were more specifically asking on more like the commercial side, who are the businesses best poised to deliver on that? I mean, aggregation design is something that's, you know, it's been out there, as you said, for, you know, 20 plus years in terms of demand response aggregators. You know, they're already designing aggregations to fit, you know, some of what I talked about earlier, some of those like Lego pieces or Tetris pieces, or call it what you will, to form, you know, a single aggregation that delivers the grid service they want to. Though in that case, mostly with either low curtailment or specifically, you know, diesel and natural gas based backup generation. Those companies are also very well poised, you know, most obviously NLX, C-Power, Centrica Business Solutions, Voltus, Energy, a couple others are very well. I mean, folks probably have seen, you know, the Generac purchase of Imbala. You know, the timing doesn't quite make sense for that to be, oh, they saw the DR order and then purchased Imbala, but, you know, those are, you know, some of the players that are interested in this. Also on the residential side, you've got, you know, your Odin Connects and others playing, Itron playing on the, you know, the residential DR side. I think in terms of other, you know, businesses, certainly, you know, I go back and forth. Automakers are an interesting one. I go back and forth into what degree they really want to get into, you know, once you get into like management of, you know, the EV chargers themselves directly, or they would more work in partnerships, frankly, with some of the companies that I talked about previously. Others more in terms of, I could certainly see, I mean, folks have probably also seen, what is it, Calibrant? It starts with a C. There's a joint venture between Siemens and Macquarie Bank. I could certainly see some folks coming in from more of the financial end of things. You know, they're very comfortable with, you know, buying or building, you know, small software shops, you know, seeing themselves as, you know, being sort of in both ends of being able to have the capital to deploy, you know, some of the resources I'm talking about, whether it's, you know, one of the things I should say is, you know, you could ask, well, what is a DR? Well, for the order, it's anything that's, you know, on the distribution system, which can include behind the meter. But to flip that around, it doesn't have to be behind the meter. So you could see them, you know, where they see opportunities, putting in, you know, self-owned, like on their own balance sheet, so to speak, you know, distribution connected, but what we would call front to meter resources in order to put them in the aggregations. That comes back to some of what I said earlier in terms of, you know, you have these three customers, but there's like a missing piece, you know, the Lego, the Tetris doesn't quite work. So then you build it yourself. So I could certainly see, you know, sort of more roll-up type strategies of, say, like a, you know, private equity firm comes in and buys like maybe a small software shop that can put together some of that, and that can also fund, whether a customer site or front to meter, can fund the actual resources themselves. Of course, the question is, you do need, you know, there are things that most, for example, you know, finance shops are not going to have. You're going to need to do this. Most obviously, you're going to need either work with one of the companies already mentioned, or you're going to need to, for example, have your own wholesale market participation, your own registration with FERC, your own MBRA, your own EQRs. I don't need to go through all the acronyms, but it's interesting to see. I mean, you know, for entirely other reasons, you've seen folks like Google and Apple take out, you know, MBRAs more in terms of what they can do in terms of like the utility scale, like solar and wind type things. But those are also companies that Apple probably is more of a stretch just because their particular focus, but you could see some of those other companies dipping their toe in, you know, they already have, you know, to take a Google, for example, they already have data centers, which have, you know, typically a data center might have a demand of somewhere in the region of, you know, might have like 30 megawatts. Okay, well, they have, you know, they have backup generation there, which they're trying to make cleaner. So they're trying to move that to whether it's battery storage, flywheels, and others. So they already have DR sitting across the country. And also, you know, in Google's case, they have extensive customer relationships, obviously, and I don't simply mean through, you know, Android phones. Could they look at this as an opportunity? They could. Whether they'll be any more successful in this area than perhaps they have been with certain things they've done in energy previously is TBD, but that's just some of the companies I would think of.
Yeah, another sort of thesis I've heard kind of floating around is owners of existing assets now, you know, seeing additional revenues being able to be thrown off by them. So, and I'm just using this as an example, not to single out anyone, but let's say Sunrun, they own a bunch of solar and storage around the country. only a small percentage of which has been able to be monetized in wholesale markets. You know, that one Massachusetts deal and that handful of California ones. Like, do you think that's like a big lever for them? Does it really move the needle, or is it actually few and far between instances where it makes sense to do this for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I will say my background for the last 10 years has been exclusively on the CNI side, on more of the residential plays. I'm frankly not as close to. I mean, certainly it gets into some of those issues that we talked about previously, particularly around dual participation. They tend to get, and particularly in some of the states you mentioned, can get very well remunerated on the retail side, where you do get into challenges around, backing out some of those payments. Then to what degree it really is a game changer for them, frankly, I defer to others. I know it's a big deal for some of the customers I work with on more of the CNI side, but is it game changing for them in terms of, they'll already be in Massachusetts, for example, they're already getting smart, they're already getting the energy storage adder, they may participate in the Clean Peak Standard, is participating in a wholesale market, if that's, currently $24,000 a megawatt year on capacity, is that, really change the needle for what they can do with either existing assets or installing new ones? I don't really have a good sense of that.
Is there anyone on who's in the resi side who has something they want to share on that?
I used to work at Sunrun, and I mean, the only way, how should I say this? It's all kind of cream on top of their core business because of the double counting. So the answer is probably not, particularly if you get into a lot of these questions about small nodes, node areas, and all of the administration required. So, I mean, the devil's in the details with metering, with rolling out a large, door-to-door sales organization. If the nodes are small, then that pretty much eliminates any possibility of them doing it too. So I'd say probably not.
I feel like I've asked this question like a couple times. I'm sorry, Peter, but it sounds like we're talking about like aggregation of DERs for ancillary services, but like what I read of the order, like it specifically called out energy and capacity as well. So like, I think the question I'm really trying to get at is like, and Ben has kind of circled around this too, is like, how does net metering not get eliminated through this order? Like net metering doesn't make any sense when you're talking about integration into a wholesale market. Like, doesn't that mean that the energy, like net metering is not integrated into wholesale markets? So I get there's this like dual participation thing, but if you don't sort of go directly at net metering in the way that VDER has, where there's now energy and capacity components of the retail value stack, how is this not just like more DR? Like I may be dumb and like not really get the market, but that's like kind of what it sounds like to me. It just sounds like ancillary services, aggregation for like frequency reg or something. So how do we not reassess net metering through this is I guess the question.
Okay. Struggling for a different way to answer that. I mean, I think in part, so no, it's not just ancillary services. So the order speaks to, I mean, much as Order 841 spoke to, all of the products that in that case energy storage, which in most cases means battery storage, was technical of delivering. It's energy, it's capacity, if that's relevant, it's ancillary services. Perhaps it's not, so the DR order that came out 2 weeks ago is not just ancillary services. If I have perhaps focused on it more, it's just because if you look at what each of the main aggregators are, have their sort of tentacles in, we probably are, have spend more of our time thinking about ancillary services than some of the others. But no, it's not simply ancillary services. It's also worth saying that, for many of the customers I deal with, energy metering is not relevant. They're not in net metering. They deliver other, they have products that aren't part of those energy metering regimes. So
but I guess it's part of like the resi question, because they're all net metering. Like, is it like a capacity payment on top of net metering? Because that sounds like double counting, right? Unless we're now looking at load reduction behind the meter and exporting as separate things.
James, there might be a foundational question to your question that I'm not clear on. Like, is net metering considered a big basket payment for all other services, and any other revenue you get when you're on net metering is double counting? Like, is that what we're saying here?
Yeah, essentially, like if you're, I mean, and this is like a question Duncan always asks, is like, why do we treat exports and load reductions as different? Because like, if you're offsetting a retail credit like 8 cents, say, you know, you pay 8 cents for retail, and or call it 10 cents, whatever, and now you get a 1-to-1 credit on that. Like embedded in that retail rate is obviously like energy supply, capacity, transmission, like all this stuff at the wholesale level. So if you're getting net metering, you're already being counted for some like energy supply or capacity components, essentially. So if you don't like unbundle that, how is this not just like, oh, you'll get a capacity payment on top of solar or more ancillary services? Like for resi, I get at CNI, like this is different, but like you're contributing to the capacity of the grid when you export, obviously, and you're getting a credit for that through NEM.
But isn't that exactly what we want, right? Is every time someone says, "Oh, I'm gonna buy a battery and put it on my solar at home," well, what's the point of that, right? Like you don't get any benefit out of that if you're on a flat retail rate. So a lot of the behind the meter DERs that currently would just fall into that sort of net metering paradigm, like they don't work if the rate you're paying is flat per kWh, assuming all of the like standard load curves that they're using to develop those retail rates. So I think you're absolutely right. The point is take away the net metering, go away from the flat rate, and let the behind the meter assets actually respond to the other market signals to tell them charge and discharge at certain times and shift loads, right?
Sorry.
Tanya, jump in.
Good. I've had my hand raised so patiently, and I'm just like, all right, forget it. I have
sorry,
my
I did not even
You
see
guys
the
are
hand
the
raised.
same.
Go.
I'm gonna just elbow my way in. Sorry, Ethan. Look, can I be like a total jerk, provocative jerk right now? Who's down?
Yes.
Do it.
All right. As far as aggregation of, in particular, small scale commercial and residential, having worked on both the power supply and the DER program side and looked at the actual economics to implement a program like this at scale, where you need reliable capacity at a reasonable price. I mean, unless you're only going to deploy 4 days out of the year when CAISO is, you know, $1,000 per megawatt. If you want to sell in at a reasonable price, there's a much bigger issue in my mind than FERC. I mean, obviously retail tariffs are one issue, but another one is it is not cost effective given the way that we aggregate with these stupid devices right now. I mean, there are like every OEM, I think it's very cute that every OEM thinks that they're going to win everything and we should all just pay to use their stupid API. And that no one will ever want to buy another battery or another light bulb or another thermostat that isn't part of their brand. If we don't start talking about standardizing open controls, communication, and data like CTA 2045 at the device level, open ADR, I mean, I know all these standards suck, but like they're all we've got. If we don't start talking about standardizing that stuff across OEMs and we let OEMs keep their weird little dream about their walled garden somehow winning the world, none of this stuff is ever going to be cost competitive with a gas peaker. I'm sorry. That's just the truth. Okay. So now I said it. You can all hate on me. Okay.
Amen. No, you're preaching to the choir. Upvotes.
Before we go off on that, I want to quickly say, I think we've gone a little over our time. Everyone is free to stay if we want to keep going, but I want to give Peter the chance to duck out, given we only booked him for an hour. So Peter, if it's time for you to leave, you know, no one's going to be offended.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, unfortunately, I do have to run. I have another thing, but yeah, really. Greatly appreciated the time here. And yeah, I'm pretty easy to find: Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., which are all proprietary platforms now I think about it, but maybe they're not so evil. But anyway, thanks for your time, and I'll be in touch.
Proprietary, but they are running on TCP/IP.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Thanks, all.
that's all I'm saying.
See you, Peter.
If there were no TCP/IP, you would not be talking to us on Twitter.
I agree. So Tanya and
I
like
love it.
anyone else, like totally open floor, because a lot of people talked about telemetry as part of this too. So like it feels like a very, sort of related question. So like how much of this is like a barrier of just like integrating assets into the market? Like we've talked in the past about settling to the meter. We don't even settle to the meter. Like how are you gonna actually track this stuff? So if anyone kind of knows anything on that side of things, it'd be interesting, because that was like one question we didn't get to with Peter.
So as a person who's somewhat deep into standards, I would actually also love the provocativeness. I would push back on Tanya's statement. I would love it if everything was just open standards, but having seen how this works, I actually think it's a better option to treat the OEMs as the partner rather than treat a residential homeowner, because for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that average residential homeowner just doesn't care about any of this stuff. So if you can make it worth the OEM's while to participate, and by the way, the average OEM also doesn't care about it, but if you can make it worth the OEM's while to participate in this stuff, they actually have a good customer relationship that you can piggyback off of. And it's like someone said before, for Sunrun, all of this stuff is just the cream on top. Like it's very hard to build a hardware business around this kind of stuff. But if you can layer that on top of an OEM offering, that's pretty high margin, repeatable revenue that they could tap into. And I don't see it being a huge financial burden. I mean, if you're talking about, I think I've heard just like hearsay, I don't actually know, but Nest gets something like $15, $20 per thermostat per year. And I think that's coming down, maybe more like $5, $10 a year per connected thermostat is more in line. That to me sounds like a decent business and a decent price to pay. I mean, they're skimming off like 10% of the total value that they're offering there or something like that.
I don't know, man, having worked with Nest and Whisker Labs and all that stuff, and you're trying to have controllable firm load, and you look at just sort of, if you were going to derate it like a solar or a wind farm, it's just not a super reliable resource. And so really trying to fix it at that sort of wholesale level, to me, what I think has real potential is, I was talking to the building decarbonization lead at PG&E. She told me about a large customer that they had that wanted to put generation in. PG&E came back and said, we're going to hit you with this really big interconnection upgrade cost. So you've got to upgrade your transformer because of this, now the load profile and power characteristics of your load. And the customer, a casino, said, well, how about this? Why don't you put a relay outside of the meter and just cut us off from the grid if we can't keep ourselves within this band that you need seasonally? And the utility is passing that through the PUC. So a load limiting tariff that for sophisticated enough customers just says, you figure out how you want to do it. Like, that's not up to the OEM. I mean, the way these OEMs are solving this right now is they're adjusting temperature set points in people's homes. Like, I don't know about you, but I have a variable speed furnace. When the temperature drops from 70 to like 69.9 and it hasn't even registered on my T-stat yet, I feel the change. And I'm like, oh no, you didn't. So to try to ratchet people's temperature set points up and down, or that's just not a scalable, I just don't believe that that's scalable.
I mean, it could be that the conclusion is the residential demand response is just not going to work, which maybe that is. But I think if it is going to work, I think it's going to be scalable through the OEMs. And then the OEMs themselves should be communicating through open standards. But I think down to the device level, you're still going to need the OEM to be involved.
But the other option is not the homeowner participating, right? It's aggregators participating. It's that you'd sign on with someone, like a sealed type of, or, relationship, and they would put different OEM derived appliances in your house and bundle them all together. back into the markets, right?
Yeah, and then they need to tap into those, whether it's open APIs or some sort of connection to the OEM to be able to control the device accordingly. But yeah, I that's another point, which is that the OEMs, you can't, because everything's measured at the meter, you can't have OEMs running separately in the same home. It needs to be aggregated at the whole home level. And so someone needs to own the homeowner or own the site rather than each individual device. It's fine when there's just a couple devices.
They have Samsung, LIFX, Tesla. That's what I'm talking about. Nobody can own the whole home cost effectively right now because every single one, what?
Can't the utility? I mean, they already own the home relationship from a retail side. If they're going to be forced into a defensive position for visibility and double counting and needing to see all the stuff that's happening in their service territory anyway, what's to suggest that they wouldn't be the aggregator themselves?
Because it's not possible. You have to go through, if you're aggregating at the home, unless you've got maybe a peak rewards tariff, which I've seen up close and they're a mess and they don't work. You have no actual, there's nothing that can adequately manage both customer preferences and flexible devices within the home because they're all in a walled garden. There's no cost-effective way to do that, and not even at the small commercial scale.
Yeah, I wouldn't want.
If the program's, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't want, an IOU messing with someone's temperature set points. That's just not what they're good at. But no, go ahead.
It's all about incentives, though. If they haven't been good at that, but if they are able to do that and they see a way to monetize that, why would they not go down that road?
Yeah, like to John's point, if John, you want to jump in, you had a great comment on this. Like, if there was a market there, why would they be incentivized to not like open up their APIs and like work with multiple providers? I don't know if John's still here, but it was in the chat.
Why would the manufacturers not be motivated?
Right.
You're asking? I mean, I think the manufacturers are way more concerned. Like, this market for them is small potatoes, right? Like, if for Sunrun, who's already in the energy business, this is not the primary driver of the market participation, then think about how small it is for Nest. Think about the relative value of one customer in 100 being unhappy and posting on Twitter about how much their thermostat sucks versus $5 a customer for the other 10. It's a no-brainer. They will suffer no pain whatsoever to their brand in order to get this very, very small extra payment.
I would just add that I think you're, Tanya and Matt, I think you're both right. I mean, at Energy Hub, we've seen these things scale cost effectively. I mean, there's like 12 programs we have with like 40 or 50,000 devices, and the utility in some cases monetizes that in the market, in some cases doesn't. But in either case, they've got 30, 50 megawatt resources that they've had for 3 or 4 years now that work well. And as long as you don't worry too much about any individual customer, and the set, if somebody doesn't want their set point controlled, they can opt out. They don't have to be in the program in the first place. So it's all about building a business case and an aggregation that performs in the way you want it to, and design the program so that when you turn the dial, you get what you want. And so if you don't worry so much about the individual pieces, you can get to scale with programs that actually earn Residio and Nest's meaningful dollars. I think, Matt, you're the open ADR guy now. I think like that will sort of open up a huge long tail. I think for me, where this is important is like DR doesn't change that much. Like, this isn't really altering the existing wholesale DR guidelines that exist. It's really, what can you now do with exporting energy to the grid and providing capacity and other services you couldn't really do easily with residential today. So I think this does two things. I think it kind of opens up a long tail of providers that want to play in this market. Like, it's not all Sunrun. It's there's probably 40 installers in Massachusetts who want to be able to participate in connected solutions, but can't. But if you can sort of stand up an open ADR end node, then all of a sudden your entire, solar plus storage portfolio in some neighborhood in Massachusetts can participate in the program and earn retail dollars. And so I think the standards-based protocols are huge, I think, to capture like the long tail of smaller providers. So I'd say that's one thing. And I think to Duncan's question about kind of fun fun ways to play this out. I'm excited about who is going to be able to join utility programs that couldn't in the past because they didn't have enough big volume. And so, you know, John Doe's solar plus storage installation in, you know, central Connecticut might have a shot. And then I think what everyone's saying is pretty much correct about like Sunrun. You know, this is all foam on the beer for them, so to speak. I think selling batteries, it doesn't make the case necessarily went to like monetize DR revenue. That doesn't like take you over the top, but I do think that we're going to start to see a lot more utilities themselves interested in storage programs where it wasn't cost effective before because they had to pay for the battery or they had to incentivize the customer to buy it. But now all of a sudden there's a whole new reason for utilities to do this because battery programs might all of a sudden become more cost effective than they were before. So that where it might not make Sunrun's case a slam dunk, I think it makes utilities a lot more interested in what they can do with batteries beyond just traditional DR.
I think the same is probably true. I totally agree on that storage point. And community solar, some of these shared front of the meter assets, utilities looking at new business models as sort of combo retail product if they can figure out a way to monetize those assets themselves. It's something that's happening in Australia in a meaningful way, and I think they're a couple of years ahead of us in this regard.
Yeah, to add on the community solar aspect, I'm an EPC basically developer, and I've been selling off all my community solar assets. And I'm like, damn, I need to figure out how to finance these myself and own them so I can take this upside, because you know it's starting to make a bigger and bigger difference in additional programs.
I guess a question for you on that, you know, if you're getting 80% of your capacity subscribed through sort of the traditional model and you have 20%, essentially, does this sort of position you like a merchant generator in the IPP world? Like you can play that 20% into the wholesale market, hypothetically?
I haven't got that far to think about it yet. And as I said, I'm not really thinking about it like an asset owner at this stage. So let me follow up in a few months. James, this seems like a huge win for David Energy, huh? It seems like the thing you were waiting for, huh?
Well, that's what I'm driving about. Not if there's not commodity exposure to DERs, which is why I'm hammering on net metering, because like it's not actual wholesale market exposure. So I don't understand how the order like reconciles with that compared to in New York where you have VDER. So questions to be answered, I guess.
Is this a jurisdictional issue that FERC can't themselves deal with net metering? That's a state regulator level decision, and so that's that tension. I mean, net metering's not long for the world in any case, but you know, as these processes now happen on state by state level, I can expect the utilities in particular are going to lean on this order and say, well, we need to deal with this over here, and therefore we should tackle net metering with that in mind. But it's going to be state by state for sure.
Right. Which is fine, you know, it's going to be state by state, but I don't see how, like, if you meaningfully do this, you know, net metering remains as is in a lot of those states that are taking it seriously.
I mean, isn't this going to blow up net metering? Because if FERC doesn't have jurisdiction over that level of the market, right? So they can't find some way to reconcile it, but they mandated that the ISOs have to let the DERs on the wholesale market. So the folks who are left looking at both sides of it, you know, the utilities and the ISOs are going to say, well, if we've got to compensate them on the wholesale market, well, then all we can do is kick them out of the retail market and, you know, try to get things back to normal that way, right? But I think it's inevitable. I mean, you know, Vermont, I'm looking at, there's big customers in Vermont who've already like capped out what kind of solar they can put behind the meter, and so they're buying batteries just so that they can make the solar pencil out so that they don't lose the value in the middle of the day because, you know, the utility capped out how much net metering you can do. And I think, you know, it's just a matter of time, and as markets mature, that net metering is going to die on its own. So I think in the long run, this is good because instead of net metering just going away, like Hawaii just fell off a cliff, right? There was no plan B. So at least we got something.
No, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Exactly. So I hope it does what you say. That's where I'm coming from as well.
All right, Dur Squad, I got to jump. As long as James and/or Colleen are recording, we can keep going now.
I unfortunately also have to jump, but I feel like this was awesome. So I'll let James, I won't make you decide if you want to
we'll take
stay
it
and
to
nerd
Twitter.
out with people.
Everyone get on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great. I love this. I learned a lot about 2222. Thanks, everybody.
So
see ya.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.